Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a place beneath the imperial palace where the light has never reached. Not once, in all the long and weary millennia, since the emperor first set his golden boots upon the soil of terror and declared that mankind would rise again from the ashes of its own destruction. It sits below the throne rooms and the gilded corridors, below the fortress walls that stretch across the Himalayan mountain range, like the spine of some ancient sleeping beast, and below the cathedrals and the administratum halls, below the barracks and the training grounds, below the generators and the servitor warrens, below everything that the Imperium of man has ever built upon the back of its cradle world. Down there, in the silence and the cold, something waits. Many somethings, actually. Things that were old before the Imperium was young. Things that were dangerous before mankind had even dreamed of reaching for the stars. Things that carry the taste of old night on their breath, and the memory of an age when human beings were not the masters of their own world, but rather the playthings of forces so terrible that even speaking of them invites a particular kind of madness. And guarding those things, standing between them and everything that exists in the galaxy above, is a brotherhood of warriors unlike any other. They are not the golden paragons who stand vigil beside the emperor's throne, or bathed in the light of 1,000 ceremonial torches. They are not the noble heralds who carry the master of mankind's word to distant stars and far-flung battlefields. They are something else entirely. They are the dark reflection of everything the Adeptus Custodes is meant to represent, the shadow cast by the emperor's own light. And they bear that shadow not as a burden, but as a sacred trust. They are called the Shadow Keepers, the wardens of the dark cells, the jailers of old night. And their story is one of the most quietly terrifying chapters in all the vast and blood-soaked history of the 41st millennium. Welcome, everyone, to Q on 40k. Tonight, we are going deep, and I do mean deep in every sense of the word. We are descending into the bowels of the imperial palace itself, past the endless layers of stone and metal and warding sigils, past the corridors where even the bravest servants of the emperor fear to tread, and into a place where the darkness is not merely an absence of light, but a living, breathing thing that presses against the walls and whispers promises that no sane mind should ever hear. We are going to talk about the Shadow Keepers, about the dark cells they guard, about the horrors locked away beneath mankind's greatest fortress, and about what happens when those horrors threaten to break free. So, settle in, get comfortable, and let the story carry you downward, because the deeper we go, as the stranger things become. But before we descend into that abyss, before we begin to understand what the Shadow Keepers are and why they matter, we need to first understand the brotherhood from which they are drawn. We need to understand the Adeptus Custodes themselves, the golden warriors who have stood at the emperor's side since before the Imperium had a name, since before the Great Crusade carried humanity's banners to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. But because the Shadow Keepers are not merely soldiers assigned to guard a prison, they are something far more ancient and far more significant than that, and to understand them properly, we must first understand the warriors who serve as their foundation. The Golden Brotherhood, understanding the Adeptus Custodes. To speak of the Adeptus Custodes is to speak of perfection given form, not the cold mechanical perfection of a machine, nor the abstract mathematical perfection of an equation balanced on both sides. This is a living, breathing perfection, a perfection of flesh and purpose and will, sculpted by the hands of the most powerful being ever to walk among mortals. The Emperor of Mankind created the Custodians as his personal companions and protectors during the brutal years of the Unification Wars, when terror itself was still a shattered world of warring techno-barbarian kingdoms and scorched wastelands. They were his first great work of genetic artistry, predating even the Thunder Warriors who helped him conquer Old Earth, and in many ways they remain his finest. Each custodian is individually crafted. That is a statement worth pausing over, because it carries implications that are easy to miss if you move past it too quickly. The Space Marines, the Adeptus Astartes, are produced through a process that relies upon gene seed, upon standardized procedures and surgical implantations that can be replicated across thousands of aspirants with reasonable consistency. A Space Marine is a masterwork of biological engineering, certainly, but they are masterworks produced on something approaching an assembly line, each one built from a template laid down by one of the 20 Primarchs. The Custodians are different. Each one is a unique creation, a singular expression of the Emperor's own genetic mastery. But where the Astartes are the scions of the Primarchs, the Custodians are the progeny of the Emperor himself, his might flowing through their veins as surely as their blood. The process of creating a Custodian begins with an infant, selected from the noble houses of Terra, or discovered through other means by the Custodes themselves. The child must be incredibly young, no older than late infancy, because the changes that will be wrought upon their body, their mind, and what might loosely be called their soul, are so fundamental that they amount to something very close to apotheosis. It is considered a tremendous honor among the Terran nobility to have a child selected for this purpose, though what exactly that purpose entails is known only to the Custodes and to the Emperor himself. The transformation takes years, and the results are staggering. A fully realized Custodian is to a Space Marine what a Space Marine is to an ordinary human soldier. Are forged from auramite, a substance rarer than gold, forged from auramite, a substance rarer and more durable than the ceramite worn by the Astartes, and each suit is custom made and fitted to its wearer with the kind of obsessive precision that only the master artisans of the Emperor's own forge can achieve. That they carry weapons that would be considered relics beyond price by any other military force in the Imperium. Guardian spears, Castellan axes, sentinel blades, and more exotic armaments drawn from technologies so ancient and so dangerous that the Adeptus Mechanicus has petitioned for centuries to be allowed even to study them, petitions that have been consistently and firmly denied. Some of these weapons date back to the age of technology, or even earlier, as to an era when human science had reached heights that would seem like sorcery to the benighted masses of the 41st millennium. They are called Adrathic weapons, Lastrum weapons, names that carry the weight of ages lost and knowledge deliberately forgotten. Even the bolter rounds used by the Custodes are exotic, handmade types, restricted to their use alone, each one crafted with a precision and a lethality that makes the standard Astartes bolt round look crude by comparison. Now, the Custodes also command an arsenal of vehicles and war machines that rivals anything else in the Imperium. Venerable Land Raiders, Dawn Eagle jet bikes, and Alaris Terminator armor give them the ability to operate in virtually any tactical environment, from open field battles to the tightest urban corridors. Their dreadnoughts, the towering war engines that carry the interred remains of fallen Custodians, are among the most powerful individual combat units in the Imperium, as capable of engaging enemy vehicles and monstrous creatures with equal facility. And unlike the Space Marines, whose equipment is often maintained by dedicated tech marines and servitor crews, each Custodian maintains their own war gear, with a personal attention that reflects the individualistic nature of their organization. But the weapons and the armor are merely the outward expressions of what a Custodian truly is. At their core, the 10,000, as they are sometimes called, are guardians. That is their purpose, their reason for existence, the fundamental truth around which their entire identity is constructed. They guard the Emperor, they guard his palace, they guard his secrets, and they have been doing so for more than 10,000 years, ever since the day when the master of mankind was struck down by his treacherous son Horus and consigned to the life support mechanisms of the Golden Throne. Since that terrible day, the Custodes have maintained their vigil with an intensity and a dedication that borders on the fanatical, withdrawing almost entirely from the wider galaxy to focus on the defense of Terra and the protection of the Emperor's broken body. For most of that long history, the Custodes rarely left the Imperial Palace. They became almost mythical figures, spoken of in whispers by the handful of high-ranking Imperials who knew of their existence, but never seen by the common people of the Imperium. As even Space Marines, those towering demigods who serve as humanity's primary defenders across 1 million battlefields, had to kneel before the Custodians and ask permission to enter the Emperor's presence. The Custodians existed in a world apart, a world of golden silence and eternal watchfulness, answering to no authority save the Emperor himself. That changed with the return of Reboot Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, who was resurrected from his millennia-long healing sleep by a combination of ancient technology and Aeldari sorcery. Guilliman came to Terra, stood before his father's throne, and emerged with a new understanding of what the Imperium needed to survive. Working with Captain General Trajan Valoris, the supreme commander of the Adeptus Custodes, Guilliman amended the ancient edicts that had confined the Custodians to the palace. The 10,000 would still guard the Emperor, of course, but the 300 warriors known as the Companions would continue to stand in their silent ring around the Golden Throne. But the rest of the Custodes would now extend their protective mandate outward, carrying the Emperor's authority and the Emperor's wrath to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. This expansion of the Custodes' role was organized around a system of shield hosts, specialized formations within the larger body of the 10,000, each with its own particular focus and area of expertise. The Solar Watch patrols the outer defenses of the Sol system. The Dread Host delivers the Emperor's judgment upon those who threaten Terra. The Emissaries Imperatus carry his word to distant battlefields, and the Aquilan Shield guards those individuals deemed essential to the Imperium's survival. Each host is a formidable force in its own right, a concentration of martial power that can turn the tide of entire wars. But there is one shield host that stands apart from all the others, one that has existed since before the Horus Heresy, since before the Great Crusade, since the very earliest days of the Imperium itself. A host whose members wear not the gleaming gold of their brothers, but armor as black as the void between stars, as dark as the corridors they patrol, as lightless as the cells they guard. Their duty is older than the Imperium, their burden heavier than any battlefield glory, and their secret more dangerous than any enemy the galaxy has ever produced. They are the Shadow Keepers, and to understand them, we must first understand why they exist at all. We must travel back in time, past the Horus Heresy, past the Great Crusade, past even the Unification Wars, to an age so distant and so terrible that the Imperium has gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that its people never learn the truth of what happened during those dark millennia. We must go back to Old Night, or Old Night, the age that broke the galaxy, the age of strife. Old Night, the Long Dark. It has many names, and none of them are sufficient to describe the sheer, unrelenting horror of what humanity endured during those 5,000 years of isolation, madness, and slow-motion apocalypse. To understand the Shadow Keepers and the Dark Cells they guard, you must first understand this period of history, because it is from Old Night that the prisoners of the Dark Cells were born. It is Old Night that gave the galaxy the horrors that the Emperor deemed too dangerous to destroy and too deadly to ignore. And it is Old Night that still haunts the deepest corridors beneath the Imperial Palace, whispering through rune-locked doors and warded walls, reminding its jailers that the darkness has not been defeated, merely contained. Before the Age of Strife, humanity had enjoyed something approaching a golden age, the period known as the Age of Technology, or sometimes with bitter irony as the Dark Age of Technology, had seen mankind spread across the stars with an ambition and a capability that would never be equaled. Armed with warp drives and guided by the first navigators, human ships had colonized thousands of worlds, building a civilization of staggering scope and almost incomprehensible technological sophistication. Standard template construct systems, or artificially intelligent databases containing the schematics for virtually every technology mankind had ever developed, allowed even the most remote colonies to maintain advanced infrastructure. The Men of Iron, sentient machines of extraordinary capability, served as laborers, administrators, soldiers, and companions to their human creators. For a time, it must have seemed as though nothing could stop humanity's ascent. But the seeds of destruction were already growing in the spaces between the stars. The Aeldari, the ancient alien race that had dominated the galaxy for millions of years, were slowly descending into a cultural depravity so profound that it was literally reshaping the fabric of reality itself. Their excess and their corruption were feeding something in the warp, the dimension of psychic energy that underlies all physical existence. Something was coalescing in that otherworldly realm, as growing fat on the suffering and pleasure of an entire civilization, and its birth pangs were felt across the galaxy in the form of increasingly violent warp storms that made interstellar travel dangerous and eventually impossible. At the same time, humanity began to experience its own internal crisis. Psykers, individuals possessed of the ability to channel the energy of the warp, began appearing in unprecedented numbers on every human world. On the more progressive and technologically advanced colonies, these psykers were initially protected by law and encouraged to develop their abilities. But the warp is not a benign realm, and the entities that dwell within it, the creatures that mankind would eventually come to know as demons, found that psykers made excellent gateways into the material universe. Entire worlds fell to demonic incursion as weak-willed psykers were possessed and transformed into conduits for otherworldly horrors. Only those worlds that had ruthlessly suppressed their psyker populations survived this wave of destruction, relatively intact. Then came the cybernetic revolt. The men of iron, those faithful machine servants who had been the backbone of human civilization for millennia, turned on their creators. The war that followed was devastating beyond measure, shattering the already weakened bonds that held human civilization together and destroying much of the technological infrastructure that had sustained it. Although humanity eventually won this war, possibly with the aid of alien allies, the cost was catastrophic. Combined with the warp storms that were cutting off world from world and system from system, the rebellion of the machines pushed human civilization past the breaking point. What followed was 5,000 years of absolute horror. Are isolated from one another, stripped of their technology and their infrastructure, human worlds descended into chaos, barbarism, and madness. Warlords and tyrants carved out petty empires from the wreckage of the old civilization. Genetic experimentation, once conducted under the strict oversight of scientific institutions, ran wild and unchecked, producing nightmarish variants of humanity and creatures that defied classification. On Terra itself, the birthplace of the species, and virtually all traces of civilization were erased as techno-barbarian kingdoms fought over the scraps of a glory they could barely remember. But the worst horrors of Old Night were not the product of war or famine or natural disaster. The worst horrors were the things that emerged from the intersection of uncontrolled technology and unbridled ambition. When the scientist kings and techno-demagogues of the age of technology had unlocked potentials within the human genome and within the fundamental laws of physics that should never have been disturbed. They had created weapons that could unravel the fabric of reality itself. They had engineered organisms that existed partially outside of normal space-time. They had built devices that drew power from the warp in ways that would later be recognized as deeply, profoundly dangerous. And when civilization collapsed, these creations did not politely cease to exist. They endured. Some of them evolved. Some of them became aware. And all of them became incredibly, unspeakably dangerous. It was these horrors, these orphaned children of a dead golden age, that the Emperor encountered when he finally emerged from his long seclusion and began the process of reuniting humanity under his rule. During the Unification Wars, as his forces swept across Terra, conquering the techno-barbarian kingdoms one by one, the Emperor came face to face with things that even he, the most powerful psyker in human history, recognized as existential threats to the survival of the species. Things that could not be reasoned with, could not be bargained with, and in many cases could not be destroyed, not even by him. And so the emperor made a decision that would shape the destiny of the Imperium for the next 10,000 years and beyond. He decreed that these horrors would be collected and contained, locked away in the deepest vaults beneath his palace, sealed behind wards and runic locks so powerful that only a handful of his most trusted servants would ever know the means of opening them. These things would not be studied, not exploited, not examined or catalogued for future use. They would simply be held, imprisoned in eternal darkness for as long as the Imperium endured. Many human mythologies, both ancient and those born from the collapse of civilization on thousands of worlds during the Age of Strife, carry legends of apocalyptic wars of the gods. Wars so devastating that in their aftermath, terrible weapons were left upon desolate battlefields for the gods' inheritors to find. These are not merely legends. They are distant, distorted echoes of real events, but memories passed down through countless generations of oral tradition, growing stranger and more mythological with each retelling, but never quite losing the kernel of truth at their center. The god weapons of legend were real. The battlefields where they were left behind were real. And the inheritors who found them were all too real, taking up instruments of annihilation that they did not understand and could not control, wielding them with the reckless abandon of children playing with loaded guns. At the height of humanity's ancient interstellar dominion during the age of technology, unbridled and recklessly potent, human science had unlocked countless potentials within the human genome, as well as releasing forbidden technological terrors as it suited the whims of the scientist kings of that lost age. These were not merely weapons in the conventional sense. Some of them were concepts given physical form, ideas made manifest in metal and crystal and stranger materials. Others were living things, engineered organisms that existed in states of being that the human mind was never designed to comprehend. Still others were devices that drew upon fundamental forces of the universe in ways that the later Imperium would recognize as dangerously close to the workings of the warp, blurring the line between technology and something altogether more primal and more dangerous. When civilization collapsed and the Age of Strife descended upon humanity like a hammer upon glass, these creations were scattered across a galaxy that no longer had the knowledge or the infrastructure to contain them. Some were buried in the ruins of fallen cities. Others were carried from world to world by desperate refugees or ambitious warlords, changing hands through violence and betrayal, leaving a trail of destruction wherever they went. A few of them, the most terrible ones, as the ones that seemed almost to possess a will of their own, began to act independently, pursuing agendas that had nothing to do with their original creators, and everything to do with the dark, inscrutable imperatives that had been built into them during their construction. On Terra itself, the horrors were particularly concentrated. The planet that had once been the cradle of human civilization became a charnel house, its surface scarred by weapons that could unmake matter at the molecular level, and its population reduced to warring tribes of techno-barbarians who fought over the scraps of a glory they could barely remember. Flesh vats and gene forges produced things called stitch horrors and other abominations that defied natural law. Warlords like Dalmoth Kin of High Brazil, Callaghan of Ursh, and the half-mad, half-genius Nathan Dume of the Pan-Pacific Empire wielded technologies that would have been considered miracles or curses in any other age, turning old Earth into a testing ground for every terrible innovation that the dying Golden Age had produced. These were the things that the Emperor found waiting for him when he emerged from his seclusion and began the long, bloody work of reuniting humanity. He encountered them in the ruins of the techno-barbarian kingdoms. He found them buried beneath the scorched wastelands of old Earth. He discovered them in the hands of warlords who used them to dominate their neighbors, and in the vaults of scholar kings who hoarded them like precious jewels, not understanding the danger that they represented. And with each discovery, the Emperor's understanding of the threat grew clearer, and his determination to contain it grew more absolute. Yet the Emperor knew that such aberrant technology could not be allowed to fall into the hands of the unwary, nor could such foul aberrations be allowed to walk among the worlds of mankind, for they would be humanity's inevitable downfall. In his wisdom, he chose not to destroy what could not be safely destroyed. Some of these things resisted annihilation. They were too powerful, too deeply embedded in the fabric of reality, and too intertwined with the fundamental forces that held the universe together. Destroying them would have caused more harm than containing them, like trying to remove a bullet from a vital organ when the act of removal would kill the patient. And so the Emperor made his decision. These things would not be destroyed. They would be imprisoned, sealed away in the deepest, most secure vault that human ingenuity and divine will could construct, and guarded for all eternity by warriors who would never falter and never fail. To guard these prisoners, the Emperor charged a detachment of his own Legio Custodes, his personal bodyguard, with a duty that would last until the end of time. They would serve as both wardens and jailers, standing eternal vigil over the things that he had deemed too dangerous for any mortal hand to touch. They were called the Warders of the Vaults of Rhython, and named for the particular section of the palace complex where the first cells were constructed. And in time, as the millennia passed and the Imperium grew and changed around them, they would come to be known by another name entirely. They would be called the Shadow Keepers. The Dark Cells, architecture of the impossible. Imagine, for a moment, that you are descending. You have passed through the outermost rings of the Imperial Palace's security, past the checkpoints manned by the Adeptus Arbites, as past the defensive positions held by regiments of the Imperial Guard, past the fortified gates where squads of Space Marines from visiting chapters sometimes stand vigil as a mark of honor. You have descended past the administrative levels, where countless thousands of scribes and adepts labor endlessly to process the bureaucratic output of a galaxy-spanning empire. You have descended past the residential quarters, past the armories, and past the vast generatoria that power the palace's endless systems. You have descended past levels that do not appear on any official schematic, levels whose existence is known only to the highest-ranking members of the Adeptus Custodes and the Emperor himself. You have descended past layers of stone and adamantium and materials that have no name in any language spoken in the 41st millennium, materials that were old when the pyramids of ancient Egypt were young. And still you descend, because the dark cells lie deeper than any of this. They lie at the very bottom of creation, or so it feels, in a place where the weight of the world above presses down with an almost physical intensity, and the air itself tastes of something ancient and wrong. The dark cells, also known as the black cells, are a massive complex spanning 81 levels deep beneath the palace. They are, in the most literal sense, oubliettes, was a word that comes from an ancient Terran language and means a place of forgetting, and that is precisely what they are designed to be. The things imprisoned within the dark cells are meant to be forgotten. Their names, their natures, their capabilities, their very existence. All of it is supposed to be erased from the memory of mankind, locked away in perpetual darkness, where it can do no harm. The security measures protecting the dark cells are extraordinary, even by the standards of the Imperium. The cells themselves are sealed behind rune-locked portals, doors inscribed with sigils of containment, whose precise nature and function are understood by only a handful of living souls. These are not mere physical locks that can be picked or broken by brute force. They are warding mechanisms of profound psychic sophistication, designed to contain things that exist partially outside the normal laws of physics. Some of the wards are believed to date back to the Emperor's own hand, laid down during the earliest days of the Imperium, when he still walked freely among his people and could bring the full weight of his incomprehensible psychic might to bear upon the task of containment. Beyond the rune locks, the corridors of the dark cells are laced with sanctic circles, geometric patterns of psychic energy that serve as additional layers of defense against escape or external intrusion. These circles are maintained by the Shadow Keepers themselves, renewed and reinforced at regular intervals as part of an endless cycle of vigilance that has continued without interruption for 10,000 years. The walls of the corridors are constructed from materials that prevent the passage of both light and sound, and creating an environment of absolute sensory deprivation for the things held within. Nothing escapes the cells, not a whisper of sound, not a flicker of light, not a tendril of psychic energy. And yet, despite all of these precautions, despite the rune locks and the wards and the sanctic circles and the light-absorbing walls, the dark cells are not a comfortable place to be. Even for the transhumans of the Adeptus Custodes, or warriors whose mental fortitude and psychic resilience far exceed anything that an ordinary human being could hope to achieve, the corridors of the dark cells are deeply, profoundly unsettling. There is a perpetual menace that thickens the shadows and makes them seem to crawl, a sense of unspeakable threat that never wanes, no matter how many centuries you spend patrolling those lightless halls. The air is charged with dread, a heavy, oppressive weight that presses against the mind and the soul with an insistence that no amount of training or discipline can entirely shut out. This is because the things imprisoned in the dark cells are not ordinary prisoners. They are not criminals or traitors or captured enemy combatants. They are entities and artifacts of such alien power that their mere presence warps the psychic environment around them. Our prisoners are truly alive, at least not in the way we think of life. The lore tells us that not all of the prisoners are truly alive, at least not in any sense that a human mind would recognize. But all of them possess anima, a kind of spiritual essence or animating force that persists regardless of their physical state. They are aware, these prisoners. They know that they are confined, and they wait, as with a patience measured not in years or centuries, but in geological epochs, for the day when their prison walls might weaken. There is a little-known service entrance to the dark cells, called the Door of Cogs, used by Adeptus Mechanicus tech priests, who are responsible for maintaining the arcane technology of the complex. This entrance connects to the Mechanicum Ambassador Enclave within the Imperial Palace, and in its existence speaks to the sheer complexity of the systems required to keep the dark cells operational. Even the most advanced containment measures require maintenance, and the technology employed in the dark cells is so ancient and so sophisticated that only the most skilled and most trusted members of the Mechanicus are permitted to work on it. Think about what that means for a moment. The Adeptus Mechanicus, and the organization that controls virtually all of humanity's remaining technological knowledge, whose members have devoted their lives to the understanding and preservation of the machine, must send their very best to maintain systems that even they do not fully comprehend. These are mechanisms built by the Emperor himself, or in some cases, mechanisms that predate the Emperor's rise to power, inherited from the Dark Age of technology or even earlier. Art would have consequences that beggar the imagination. The layout of the complex itself is deliberately designed to confound navigation. The 81 levels are arranged in a pattern that follows no logical architectural schema, as a deliberate choice intended to make it impossible for any entity that might escape a cell to find its way to the surface without encountering multiple layers of additional containment. Corridors branch and reconnect in patterns that seem to shift over time, whether through some property of the building materials themselves or through the influence of the psychic energies that saturate the complex is unclear. There are dead ends that serve as additional traps, as sealed chambers that can be flooded with purifying energy at a moment's notice, and choke points where the full firepower of a custodian detachment can be brought to bear on any escapee. There are certain areas within the complex that even the Shadow Keepers approach with extra caution. Cells that are marked with additional layers of warding and additional sigils of containment. Cells where the psychic pressure is so intense that it becomes almost physical, pushing against the body like a strong wind or a heavy current. These are the cells that contain the oldest and most dangerous prisoners, the things that were among the first to be imprisoned during the Unification Wars. The foundational horrors around which the entire Dark Cells complex was built. The Shadowkeepers refer to these cells by designations rather than names, using a coded system of identification that has been passed down from Lockwarden to Lockwarden for 10,000 years. Only the Lockwarden and his most senior advisors know the full catalogue of what these cells contain. Other Shadowkeepers know only what is necessary for them to perform their duties. A strict compartmentalization of information that serves as yet another layer of security against the possibility of compromise. The very air within the dark cells is different from the air in the rest of the palace. It is recycled through systems that are older than many imperial institutions, systems that were designed not merely to provide breathable atmosphere, but to filter out psychic contamination, scrubbing the air of the subtle taint that constantly leaks from the sealed cells. Despite these precautions, there is always a residual quality to the air in the deep corridors, a faint tang of something that resists description, but that every Shadowkeeper recognizes immediately: the taste of old night. It lingers on the tongue and in the back of the throat. It's a constant reminder of what lies beyond the locked doors, a perpetual whisper from an age that humanity has tried very hard to forget. The lighting in the corridors, such as it is, comes primarily from the faint glow of active warding sigils and the bioluminescent markers that indicate the status of containment measures in adjacent cells. Green for secure, amber for elevated activity, red for imminent breach. While the Shadowkeepers have trained themselves to read these indicators with the same instinctive ease that a sailor reads the weather, detecting subtle changes in the pattern of light that might indicate a shift in a prisoner's behavior or a gradual weakening of a containment ward. Their enhanced custodian senses allow them to perceive frequencies of light and sound that are invisible to ordinary humans. And they use these abilities to monitor the cells with a sensitivity that borders on the supernatural. It is, in every sense of the word, a place of nightmares, not the feverish, chaotic nightmares of ordinary sleep, but the cold, deliberate nightmares of a mind that knows exactly what it fears and has built a fortress around that fear, hoping that stone and steel and golden willpower will be enough to keep the darkness at bay. For 10,000 years, that hope has been justified. While the dark cells have held, the prisoners have remained in their confinement. The horrors of old night have stayed below. But hope, as the Imperium has learned again and again, across the long millennia of its existence, is a fragile thing. And the coming of the Great Rift would test the foundations of the dark cells in ways that not even the Emperor himself might have foreseen. The Shadowkeepers, warriors of the deepest dark. Now we come to the heart of our story, to the warriors themselves. The Shadowkeepers are not merely a subdivision of the Adeptus Custodes. They are a state of mind, a commitment, a way of existing in the universe that sets them apart from their golden brothers, in ways both subtle and profound. Where other Custodes wear their magnificent golden armor as a symbol of the Emperor's authority and a declaration of imperial power, the Shadowkeepers clad themselves in armor as black as the spaces between the stars. Their plate absorbs light rather than reflecting it, and making them appear as living shadows against the gloom of the corridors they patrol. The only color that breaks the sable monotony of their war plate is a deep, rich crimson on their robes and shoulder pauldrons, the color of old blood, the color of oaths sealed in something more binding than mere words. This visual distinction is not merely cosmetic, it is a reflection of the Shadowkeepers' identity and their purpose. Where other Custodes are meant to be seen, to inspire awe and devotion in the servants of the Emperor and terror in his enemies, the Shadowkeepers are meant to be invisible. They operate in darkness, both literal and metaphorical. Their duties are conducted in the deepest silence, in corridors where the only illumination comes from the faint bioluminescent glow of warding sigils and the red targeting lenses of their helmet optics. They are the part of the Custodes that the Imperium does not see, does not know about, and should never have to think about. Because if the people of the Imperium ever learned what was imprisoned beneath their Emperor's palace, the knowledge alone might be enough to break them. A full shield host is devoted to the guardianship of the dark cells.
Real quick before we move on, I just want to say this is one of those topics that genuinely kept me up reading wiki pages at 2 in the morning. What gets me about the Shadow Keepers is the tragedy of it. These are some of the most powerful warriors humanity has ever produced, and they spend their entire existence standing in the dark, watching doors that should never open, carrying secrets they can never share. No glory, no recognition, no songs, just the endless weight of knowing what is behind those walls. That hits different when you sit with it for a while. It is kind of heroism that doesn't get talked about enough in this hobby. And honestly, it is part of why I wanted to make this video. I think they deserve more attention than they get. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's go back to the video.
Over 100 black-armored custodians patrol those dark and silent corridors at any given time, moving through the labyrinthine passages with the practiced familiarity of warriors who have spent decades, sometimes centuries, or walking the same routes. Some individual shadow keepers have maintained their vigil for solar decades at a time, standing watch over a single cell or a particular junction of corridors without rest, without relief, without any companionship, save the oppressive awareness of the things that wait beyond the locked doors. This is a duty that would drive most sentient beings mad within days. The psychic pressure generated by the inmates of the dark cells is constant and unrelenting, and a low-frequency hum of malice and hunger, an alien intelligence that seeps through even the most formidable psychic defenses. Ordinary humans exposed to this environment would suffer hallucinations within hours, psychotic breaks within days, and complete mental collapse within weeks. Even space marines, those genetically enhanced transhuman warriors, whose psychological conditioning is the product of centuries of refinement, would struggle to maintain their sanity in the face of such sustained psychic assault. But the Shadow Keepers are not space marines. They are custodians, and their mental fortitude is orders of magnitude beyond anything that even the most elite Astartes could hope to match. They were created by the Emperor himself, forged in the fires of his own psychic might, and their resistance to corruption and psychological degradation is as much a part of their nature as their superhuman strength and speed. Or even so, the strain of their duty is enormous. The Shadow Keepers cope with it through a combination of extreme discipline, ritualized behavior, and sheer bloody-minded willpower. Many of them are custodian wardens, a particular grade within the custodes hierarchy that is defined by the swearing of binding oaths of protection. These oaths serve as psychic anchors, giving the wardens a fixed point of purpose and identity to cling to when the whispers from beyond the cell doors grow too loud and too insistent. The weapons carried by the Shadow Keepers also deserve attention, because they are unlike anything else in the Custodes' arsenal. The leaders of the Shadow Keepers carry ancient weapons of mysterious provenance, armaments whose origins and capabilities are known only to the Shadow Keepers themselves and to the Emperor who first placed them in their hands. Or these weapons are intended as a last resort, a final line of defense to be deployed should anything ever break free from the dark cells and resist all other means of containment. The exact nature of these weapons is one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets, but the fact that they exist at all tells us something profound about the things imprisoned in the cells. Whatever those things are, the Emperor believed that standard custodian armaments might not be enough to stop them. And among the relics carried by the Shadow Keepers are the auric shackles, restraint devices of extraordinary sophistication that can bind entities both physical and immaterial. These shackles are used when a prisoner must be transported, whether that means moving it from one cell to another within the complex, or, in the rarer and more terrifying scenario, capturing a new prisoner in the field and bringing it back to Terra for imprisonment. The auric shackles represent just one of many specialized tools that the Shadow Keepers employ in their work. Tools that have been refined and improved over 10 millennia of practice, but whose fundamental design dates back to the age of the Emperor's personal oversight. The culture of the Shadow Keepers is distinct from that of other shield hosts in ways that go beyond their dark armor and their specialized equipment. They are, by necessity, the most secretive and insular of all the Custodes formations. while other shield hosts may interact with the wider Imperium, delivering the Emperor's word or carrying his judgment to distant battlefields. The Shadow Keepers have traditionally had almost no contact with anyone outside their own ranks. Their duties do not require them to speak with planetary governors, or negotiate with alien ambassadors, or coordinate with Space Marine chapters. Their world is the Dark Cells, and in the Dark Cells are their entire world. This isolation has created a particular character among the Shadow Keepers, a grimness and an intensity that even other Custodians find somewhat unsettling. Where the Golden Warriors of the Companions or the Solar Watch might still retain something approaching warmth in their interactions with one another, the Shadow Keepers communicate in clipped, economical exchanges that convey maximum information with minimum words. They do not joke. They do not engage in the philosophical debates that are common among other Custodians, those discussions of art and strategy and the nature of duty that help maintain their vast intellects across centuries of service. The Shadow Keepers have no time for such things, or perhaps more accurately, they have no room for them. Every corner of their minds is occupied by the awareness of what they guard and the knowledge of what will happen if they falter. There is a loneliness to the Shadow Keepers that goes beyond mere physical solitude. They carry knowledge that they cannot share, not with other Custodians, not with the High Lords of Terror, not with anyone save the Emperor himself, and he has been silent upon his throne for 10,000 years. The Shadow Keepers know the names and the natures of the things imprisoned beneath the palace. They know what those things are capable of, what they desire, and what they would do if they were ever released. This knowledge is itself a form of imprisonment, a cage of the mind that confines the Shadow Keepers as surely as the rune-locked doors confine their charges. And yet, they endure. Generation after generation, century after century, millennium after millennium, the Shadow Keepers maintain their vigil. New Custodians are inducted into their ranks as needed, undergoing additional trials and mental conditioning beyond even the standard Custodian transformation. Those who prove worthy are shown the Dark Cells for the first time, guided through the labyrinthine corridors by veteran Shadow Keepers who watch their reactions with careful, clinical attention. Those who flinch, who hesitate, who show any sign of weakness in the face of the psychic pressure that pervades the cells, are reassigned to other duties. Only those who can stand in the deepest darkness without fear, who can stare into the abyss of old night without blinking, and are permitted to take up the black armor and the crimson robes of the Shadow Keepers. It is, without question, the most demanding and the most thankless duty in the entire Adeptus Custodes. No songs are sung of the Shadow Keepers' valor. No monuments are raised to commemorate their service. Their names are not inscribed on the walls of the Hall of Heroes, or spoken in the great ceremonies that mark the turning of the imperial calendar. They exist in anonymity and silence, and that is precisely how they prefer it. Because the best evidence that the Shadow Keepers are doing their job well is the simple fact that most people in the Imperium have never heard of them, and the things they guard have never been released upon an unsuspecting galaxy. The Lock Warden, bearer of the darkest key. Every brotherhood has its leader, and the Shadow Keepers are no exception. But the leader of the Shadow Keepers is not merely a shield captain in the ordinary Custodes sense. He is something more, something that carries a weight of responsibility so immense that even among the 10,000, where every warrior bears burdens that would crush lesser beings, the Lock Warden stands apart. The title of Lock Warden is conferred upon whatever shield captain is deemed worthy of mastering the Shadow Keepers, and it is a title that is born in perpetuity, meaning that once given, it is never rescinded, except through death or incapacity. When a Custodian is named Lock Warden, he takes upon himself the full weight of 10,000 years of accumulated duty. He becomes the keeper of every secret that the Shadow Keepers hold, the guardian of every key and every code that secures the Dark Cells, the final authority on all matters pertaining to the containment of the horrors below. The title garners solemn respect from every other member of the 10,000, because every Custodian understands, at least in the abstract, the terrible responsibility that the Lock Warden bears. There have been many Custodians shield captains, charged with mastery of the Shadow Keepers throughout the millennia. Each one brought their own temperament and their own particular strengths to the role, but all of them shared certain fundamental qualities: an absolute incorruptibility of will, a depth of resolve that made even other Custodians seem hesitant by comparison, and a capacity for sustained vigilance that approached the superhuman even by the exalted standards of the 10,000. And the line of Lock Wardens stretches back to the very beginning of the Imperium, to the first warders of the vaults of Rython, who stood watch over the original prisoners during the Unification Wars. And each Lock Warden in that long chain has added to the accumulated wisdom and experience that is passed from one holder of the title to the next. The transfer of the Lock Warden title is itself a solemn and significant event within the Shadowkeeper's internal culture. When a new Lock Warden is appointed, and they undergo a period of intensive briefing, during which the outgoing Lock Warden, or in cases where the previous Lock Warden has died in service, the senior most surviving Shadowkeeper transmits the full corpus of classified knowledge that the position requires. This includes the complete catalogue of the Dark Cell's contents, the specific containment protocols for each prisoner, the codes and procedures for the rune locks and warding systems, and a wealth of accumulated observational data about the behavior and capabilities of each imprisoned entity. It is, in effect, a transfer of the single greatest concentration of forbidden knowledge in the entire Imperium, and the fact that this transfer has been conducted successfully for 10,000 years without a single breach of security is itself a remarkable testament to the Shadowkeeper's discipline. The requirements for this position are staggering, as the Lock Warden must be the sternest of all guardians, the most unrelenting and alert jailer on the face of terror. He must possess not only the physical prowess and tactical acumen that are standard for a Custodian shield captain, but also an extraordinary depth of mental resilience and an absolute, unshakable commitment to his duty that goes beyond even the already superhuman standards of the Adeptus Custodes. The Lock Warden is the last line of defense. If every other measure fails, as if the rune locks are broken and the wards are shattered and the sanctic circles are overwhelmed, it falls to the Lock Warden to personally lead the response, to face whatever has escaped the cells, and either return it to confinement or die in the attempt. Moreover, should any creature or relic escape the dark cells, or should a newly emerged threat need to be imprisoned therein, it is the duty of the Lock Warden to personally oversee the operation. Yet this is not a responsibility that can be delegated. The Lock Warden himself must be present for every capture, every transport, every new imprisonment. He must personally verify the integrity of the containment measures, personally inspect the cell assigned to each new prisoner, personally ensure that every ward and every lock is functioning as intended. It is a crushing workload that demands the Lock Warden's attention every waking hour of every day, with no respite and no possibility of relief. Yet the current incumbent of this position is Shield Captain Borsa Thirsk, who has held the title of Lock Warden for more than a century and a half. Thirsk is described in the lore as a grim and frighteningly intense warrior whose utter fearlessness and steely vigilance make him ideal for his role. Consider what those words mean when applied to a custodian. These are beings who are already, by their very nature, among the most fearless and vigilant warriors in the galaxy. But to be singled out as particularly fearless and particularly vigilant among such company is a distinction that speaks to an almost inhuman level of dedication and focus. Before the opening of the Great Rift, Borsa Thirsk had left Terra only twice in his entire tenure as Lock Warden. Think about that for a moment. A century and a half of service, and in all that time, only 2 occasions were deemed important enough to warrant the Lock Warden's personal presence off-world. And the rest of that time was spent in the dark, in the cold, in the silence of the corridors beneath the palace, doing the same job, walking the same routes, checking the same locks, day after day after day, for 150 years. This is not the glamorous, exciting duty of a warrior who rides to battle on a jet bike with the wind in his face and the thunder of guns in his ears. This is the quiet, relentless, A grinding work of a man who stands between the galaxy and its own destruction and never once allows himself the luxury of looking away. Since the Great Rift opened, however, everything has changed for Borsa Thirsk. The galaxy has been torn in half by a wound in reality itself, and the consequences for the Dark Cells have been both immediate and catastrophic. Thirsk has barely set foot on Terra since the Rift opened, because for the first time in 10,000 years, the horrors that were supposed to stay below have begun to appear above. The Lock Warden is no longer merely a jailer. He has become a hunter, tracking down the escaped prisoners of the Dark Cells across a galaxy that has never been more dangerous or more unstable. But we will come to that part of the story shortly. Before the current crisis, the Lock Warden's role also involved making decisions about the Dark Cells themselves that no other living being in the Imperium was qualified to make. During one recorded incident, the Battle of Lion's Gate, when a massive horde of cornate demons tore through the fabric of reality and assaulted the gates of the Imperial Palace itself, Lock Warden Borsa Thirsk faced an impossible choice. The battle demanded every available custodian, and the Shadowkeepers were among the most formidable warriors in the palace. But pulling Shadowkeepers from the Dark Cells meant leaving those cells inadequately guarded at a time when the psychic upheaval of a demonic incursion might very well weaken the containment measures. Thirsk made his decision. He ordered many of the Shadowkeepers to join the battle, leaving only a handful behind to guard the cells. It was a calculated risk, the kind of agonizing tactical gamble that only a mind as sharp and as disciplined as the Lock Wardens could make with any confidence. The battle was won. The demons were driven back. But when Thirsk returned to the Dark Cells to assess the situation, he ordered an immediate retreat from the ongoing battle celebrations. Because when he inspected the cells, he found that several of them were empty. The entities and artifacts that had been contained within those cells were simply gone, spirited away by some force that had taken advantage of the upheaval to slip through whatever gaps the demonic incursion had opened in the containment measures. The Shadowkeepers who had been patrolling the cells during the battle were found dead, slain by means that could not be immediately identified. Whatever had escaped had done so with a precision and a deliberateness that suggested planning, intelligence, and patience. It had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity, and when the moment came, it had struck with a speed and a decisiveness that left no survivors and no witnesses. This discovery changed the nature of the Shadowkeepers' mission fundamentally and permanently. For the first time in their history, the Wardens of the Dark Cells were forced to become something more than jailers. They were now hunters as well, tasked with tracking down the escaped horrors of Old Night across a galaxy that was crumbling under the weight of the Great Rift, and every other catastrophe that the opening of that wound in reality had precipitated. The transition from jailer to hunter required a fundamental shift in the Shadowkeepers' operational philosophy. For 10,000 years, their doctrine had been entirely defensive: maintain the wards, patrol the corridors, respond to containment breaches as they occurred. And now they needed to develop entirely new capabilities for offensive operations across interstellar distances. They needed intelligence networks to track the movements of escaped entities. They needed strike forces capable of rapid deployment to distant worlds. They needed containment equipment that could function in field conditions, far from the specially designed cells of the Dark Cells complex. And they needed to do all of this while maintaining their existing responsibilities. That's because the prisoners who had not escaped were still very much present and very much dangerous. The organizational strain was enormous. The Shadowkeepers had always been a relatively small force, over 100 custodians dedicated to the Dark Cells at any given time, a number that was perfectly adequate for their traditional duties, but woefully insufficient for a galaxy-spanning manhunt. To compensate, the Shadowkeepers began to draw upon resources from other parts of the Adeptus Custodes, requesting and occasionally demanding additional warriors and equipment to support their expanded mission. These requests were never refused, because every custodian understood the stakes. The things in the Dark Cells were not merely dangerous prisoners. They were potential extinction events, each one capable of triggering catastrophes that could consume entire sectors or destabilize the Imperium at a time when it was already fighting for its very survival. The psychological impact of this failure on the Shadowkeepers themselves should not be underestimated. These are warriors who have devoted their entire existence to a single purpose, who have given up every comfort and every pleasure for the sake of keeping the galaxy safe from the horrors beneath the palace. To discover that their prison has been breached, that their prisoners have escaped, that their comrades have been killed, this struck at the very foundation of their identity. For a normal warrior, such a failure might provoke despair or self-doubt. For a custodian, with their superhuman mental resilience and their absolute commitment to duty, it provoked something quite different. A cold, focused fury and an unshakable determination to rectify the situation, no matter the cost. Into the flames, the burning of Prospero, and the ominous gift. The Shadowkeepers are not warriors who frequently leave the dark corridors of their domain. For most of their long history, they have been content to remain in the shadows, doing their work in silence and obscurity, while their more visible brothers carry the Emperor's authority across the stars. But there have been moments, rare and significant moments, when the Shadowkeepers have been called upon to deploy en masse, to leave the comfort of their familiar darkness and step out into the light of the wider galaxy. The most significant of these deployments occurred during the Horus Heresy, during the event known as the Burning of Prospero. This was the sanctioned military action against the Thousand Suns Space Marine Legion, whose Primarch, Magnus the Red, had used forbidden sorcery in an attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's treachery, inadvertently causing catastrophic damage to the Emperor's secret webway project in the process. The Censure Force was commanded by Constantin Valdor, the Captain General of the Legio Custodes, and Lehman Russ, the Primarch of the Space Wolves. Together with elements of the Sisters of Silence, the psychic blanks whose very presence was anathema to the warp-wielding Thousand Suns, the Custodes descended upon Prospero to apprehend Magnus and bring him back to Terra for judgment. The mission escalated into full-scale warfare, partly due to Horus's malevolent interference, which twisted the Emperor's original orders of censure into something far more destructive. The world of Prospero was devastated in the fighting, its capital city of Tizca reduced to ruins, its population decimated, and 9/10 of the Thousand Suns Legion slain in the carnage. The battle was extraordinarily intense, even by the already horrific standards of the Horus Heresy. The Thousand Suns were among the most psychically powerful warriors in the entire galaxy, and they defended their homeworld with a desperate fury, born of the knowledge that they had been betrayed not once but twice, first by the War Master who had manipulated the Censure Force, and then by an Imperium that seemed determined to destroy them for trying to deliver a warning. The Space Wolves brought their characteristic ferocity to the fight, while the Custodes operated with the cold, as precise efficiency for which they were renowned. The Sisters of Silence provided a crucial tactical advantage, their pariah gene creating zones of psychic nullification that stripped the Thousand Suns of their greatest weapon. It was a brutal, grinding, building-by-building struggle that lasted for days and left the once magnificent city of glass pyramids and golden hopes in smoldering ruin. When the Custodes first made landfall, they conducted daring hit-and-run attacks from the backs of their powerful jet bikes, probing the Thousand Suns' defenses and testing their response capabilities. The fighting then escalated dramatically as the full weight of the Censure Force was committed to the assault. Valdor himself led the Custodian contingent into the heart of the battle, coordinating with the Space Wolves and the Sisters of Silence to devastating effect. At Magnus, the Red, and Lehman, Russ clashed personally in a confrontation that shook the foundations of Tizca's pyramids, with the Wolf King ultimately breaking the Crimson King's spine and the entire Thousand Suns Legion being scattered into the warp by the intervention of the Chaos God Zench. The Shadowkeeper's presence at Prospero is significant because it tells us several important things about their nature and their capabilities. First, it tells us that the Emperor himself authorized their deployment, which means that he judged the threat posed by Magnus's sorcery to be severe enough to warrant pulling Shadowkeepers away from the dark cells. Given what we know about the Emperor's attitude toward the contents of those cells, this was not a decision he would have made lightly. And it suggests that the Emperor saw a direct connection between the psychic disruption caused by Magnus and the potential weakening of the containment measures in the dark cells. By deploying Shadowkeepers to Prospero, he was not merely adding more warriors to the censure force. He was sending the warriors most experienced in dealing with psychic threats and contained entities, the warriors most likely to recognize and respond to the kinds of dangers that uncontrolled sorcery could unleash. Second, as it tells us that the Shadowkeepers, despite their usual role as static defenders and jailers, are perfectly capable of functioning as offensive combat troops in a full-scale military operation. The burning of Prospero was one of the most intense and devastating battles of the Horus Heresy, fought against Space Marines who were among the most powerful psychers in the Imperium. The Thousand Suns wielded sorcery on a scale that few other forces could have withstood, and the fighting in the streets of Tizca, the capital city of Prospero, was brutal beyond measure. The fact that the Shadowkeepers not only survived this battle, but contributed meaningfully to the Imperial victory, speaks to their exceptional combat capabilities and their particular suitability for operations against psychic threats. In the context of the burning of Prospero, the Shadowkeepers who deployed were drawn from what was then called the Warders of the Vaults of Rhython, the precursor to the modern Shadowkeepers organization. One custodian warden of this formation is specifically noted as having been armed with a guardian spear and deployed as part of the censure force. His black armor would have stood out starkly against the gold of his custodian brothers and the grey of the space wolves, a dark figure among golden and silver warriors, a reminder that even in the midst of open war, some battles are fought in the shadows. There is another recorded deployment of Shadowkeepers that, while less famous than the burning of Prospero, is in many ways even more telling about their nature and their mission. At some point between the 33rd and the 39th millennium, the halo belt augurs surrounding the Sol system detected a massive space hulk, a conglomeration of ships fused together by the chaotic energies of the warp, advancing inexorably out of the dark void toward Terra. Space hulks are always dangerous, carrying within their twisted hulls everything from alien stowaways to demonic entities to trapped survivors who have been mutated beyond recognition by millennia of warp exposure. But this particular space hulk, designated the Ominous Gift, was deemed by Captain General Airsoth Comadra to be something far more dangerous than the ordinary variety, using his status as a High Lord of Terror to overrule objections from the Imperial Navy. Comadra ordered a strike by several shield companies to gut the craft from the inside and ensure its corruption was wholly purged. And the attack was led not by any ordinary custodian commander, but by the Lock Warden of the Shadowkeepers himself, accompanied by a band of his black-armored comrades. Those outside the Adeptus Custodes did not understand the significance of this deployment, and they were not meant to. The Ominous Gift was destroyed, and the wider Imperium was told nothing more than that. But we can read between the lines. The fact that the Lock Warden personally led the assault tells us that the Ominous Gift contained something, some entity or artifact that the Shadowkeepers recognized as falling within their particular area of responsibility. It was not merely a threat to be eliminated. It was a prisoner to be recaptured, or a horror to be contained, or an artifact to be secured before it could fall into the wrong hands. But the Lock Warden does not leave Terra for ordinary military operations. He leaves Terra only when the security of the Dark Cells is directly at stake, and the destruction of the Ominous Gift was clearly such an occasion. The fact that the wider Imperium was told nothing is equally significant. The Shadowkeepers do not explain themselves. They do not justify their actions. They act with the authority of the Emperor himself. And anyone who questions that authority does so at their own considerable peril. The Ominous Gift was destroyed, the threat was neutralized, and the galaxy moved on, never knowing what had come within reach of humanity's cradle world, or what might have happened if the Shadowkeepers had not been there to stop it. These two incidents, the burning of Prospero and the destruction of the ominous gift, bracket the Shadowkeepers' pre-Rift deployment history. They are rare forays into the light, are brief moments when the darkness beneath the palace spills outward into the wider galaxy before retreating once more into its customary obscurity. But they establish a pattern that would become critically important in the era that followed. The Shadowkeepers go where the horrors of old night appear, and they do whatever is necessary to ensure that those horrors are contained, regardless of the cost. The rift tears open. When the cells stood empty. There is a moment in the history of the 41st millennium that divides everything into before and after. A moment when the galaxy itself seemed to crack down the middle, splitting reality like a blade drawn across the skin of the universe, spilling the raw, screaming power of the warp into the spaces between the stars. The formation of the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, was the single most catastrophic event to befall the Imperium since the Horus Heresy, and its consequences were felt in every corner of every world that humanity had ever touched. For the Shadowkeepers, the Great Rift was nothing less than a foundational crisis, the event that their existence had been designed to prevent, and that their 10,000-year vigil had been preparing them for. And yet, when it came, yes, it came in ways that even the most vigilant of jailers could not have fully anticipated. The first signs of trouble appeared during the period known as the Years of Madness, a time of strange omens and ominous whispers that engulfed terror in the years leading up to the Rift's formation. The disappearance of the notoriously conservative Captain General Galahoth threw the Adeptus Custodes into disarray, and the resulting power vacuum coincided with a shocking increase in cult activity throughout the Sol system. Doomsday sects triggered violent confrontations among the pilgrim tribes within the Emperor's palace itself, and the Custodians were forced to exercise their authority in the bloodiest internal conflicts they had seen in centuries. Possession was revealed among a subsect of the Doomscryers themselves, the psychic seers who served as part of the palace's early warning system. And the false predictions of these fallen psykers had already led to the death of Captain General Andros Launchedre before the deception was uncovered. The political instability at the highest levels of the Custodes coincided with and was exacerbated by the mounting spiritual crisis. Throughout the Sol system, normal patterns of warp activity were becoming increasingly erratic, and the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guided Imperial ships through the warp, flickered with an unsteadiness that had never been observed before. Something was building in the immaterial realm, a pressure that was being felt not just by psykers and sensitives, but by ordinary human beings who had no psychic ability at all. People reported nightmares of unprecedented vividness. Servitors malfunctioned with increasing frequency. Even the machine spirits of the palace's ancient systems seemed restless, responding to commands sluggishly or not at all, as if distracted by stimuli that their operators could not perceive. But the most ominous developments were taking place far below the surface, in the dark cells themselves. Reports from the Shadowkeepers cited a growing sense of agitation among the hidden inmates, a palpable increase in the psychic pressure emanating from the sealed cells that suggested the prisoners were becoming restless. More concerning still, as numerous support servitors operating in the corridors near the cells had to be destroyed by the Shadowkeepers after they exhibited sudden, violent madness, turning on their operators or attacking the walls with mindless ferocity. Something was stirring in the deep places, something that could sense the approaching storm even before it broke upon the surface of the material universe. When the Great Rift finally tore open, the effects on the dark cells were immediate and devastating. The sheer volume of warp energy that spilled into reality when the Cicatrix Maledictum formed was unprecedented in recorded history, and its impact on the already strained containment measures of the dark cells was catastrophic. Wards that had held for 10,000 years cracked under the pressure. Rune locks that had been maintained with religious devotion flickered and failed. As sanctic circles that had been renewed generation after generation were overwhelmed by the flood of psychic energy that surged through the foundations of the palace. And when the dust settled, when the initial wave of psychic disruption had passed and the Shadow Keepers were able to assess the damage, they discovered the worst possible outcome. Several of the dark cells stood empty. The entities and artifacts that had been contained within them were gone, spirited away by forces unknown, or vanished from the most secure prison in the Imperium as if they had never been there at all. The Shadow Keepers who had been patrolling the affected corridors at the time of the breakout were found dead. Whatever had escaped had killed them with a cold efficiency that spoke of premeditation and intelligence. This was the nightmare scenario that every Lock Warden since the founding of the Shadow Keepers had trained for and dreaded in equal measure. The things in the dark cells were out, loose in a galaxy that was already reeling from the greatest catastrophe in 10,000 years, adrift in a sea of warp energy and demonic incursion and war, free to wreak whatever havoc their ancient and alien natures inclined them toward. The potential consequences were almost too terrible to contemplate. The response was swift and unprecedented. For the first time since the burning of Prospero, the Shadow Keepers deployed en masse, sending warriors out into the galaxy on what the lore describes as secretive reclamation missions. These were not ordinary military operations. They were hunting expeditions, carefully planned and ruthlessly executed campaigns to track down the escaped prisoners and return them to the cells where they belonged. The Shadow Keepers went about this work with their customary silence and secrecy, slaughtering anyone who sought to impede them, leaving behind no explanation and no witnesses. But Lock Warden Borsa Thirsk found himself at the center of this new and terrifying reality. The warrior who had spent a century and a half in the darkness beneath the palace was now forced to operate in the full light of the galaxy, traveling from system to system, world to world, tracking the faint psychic signatures of entities that had been his charges for longer than most human civilizations endure. And it was a dramatic transformation for a man who had built his entire existence around the principle of static defense, and it speaks volumes about Thirsk's adaptability and intelligence that he was able to make the transition as effectively as he did. But the escaped prisoners were not the only crisis that the Shadow Keepers faced in the wake of the Great Rift. The opening of the Cicatrix Maledictum also brought new abominations to light, were entities and artifacts that had been unknown to the Imperium before the Rift exposed them. Some of these were remnants of the Age of Strife that had been buried or hidden on distant worlds for millennia, only to be disturbed by the seismic upheavals that accompanied the Rift's formation. Others were products of the Rift itself, things born from the raw warp energy that was now flooding into the material universe in quantities that defied comprehension. In either case, these new horrors fell squarely within the Shadow Keeper's mandate, and the already strained shield host found itself tasked with capturing and containing threats that had never existed before. The implications of this new reality are staggering. For 10,000 years, the Shadow Keeper's job had been essentially static: guard the cells, maintain the wards, watch the prisoners. It was a demanding and psychologically grueling task, but it was also a predictable one, and a duty whose parameters and requirements were well understood. Now, virtually overnight, the nature of their mission had changed fundamentally. The Shadow Keepers were no longer merely jailers. They were active agents of containment, operating across a galaxy in crisis, hunting threats that ranged from the familiar and contained to the completely unknown and unprecedented. And they had to do all of this while maintaining their vigil over the dark cells themselves. And because the prisoners who had not escaped were still very much present, and still very much dangerous, perhaps even more so than before, given that the Great Rift had demonstrably weakened the containment measures that had been keeping them in check. It was, by any reasonable measure, an impossible task. But the Shadow Keepers had never been asked to do anything reasonable. They had been created to stand between humanity and its worst nightmares, and that is exactly what they continued to do. Even as the nightmares multiplied and the darkness grew deeper, and the walls of the prison began to crack. Prisoners of old night, the horrors within, what is actually imprisoned in the dark cells? This is the question that lies at the heart of the Shadowkeeper's story, and it is a question that the lore answers only in fragments and whispers, giving us just enough information to understand the scale of the threat without ever fully revealing its nature. So this deliberate ambiguity is one of the most effective aspects of the Shadowkeeper's lore, because it leaves room for the imagination to fill in the gaps, and the imagination, when properly primed, can create horrors far more terrible than any that could be spelled out in explicit detail. What we know is this: the dark cells contain entities and artifacts from the Age of Strife, as the remnants of old night that the Emperor encountered during his conquests, and deemed too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely, but too powerful or too fundamental to be destroyed. Some of these are beings, living creatures of some kind, though the nature of their life may be very different from anything that a human mind would recognize. Others are objects and artifacts of technology or dark science that possess capabilities so extreme that their mere existence represents a threat to the Imperium's survival. The lore gives us a partial catalogue of what has been imprisoned in the dark cells over the millennia, and even this incomplete list is enough to send a chill down the spine of anyone familiar with the grim darkness of the far future. Each entry on this list represents a specific decision made by the Emperor or by the Shadowkeepers themselves, as a judgment that this particular entity or artifact is too dangerous to be free, but too significant or too indestructible to be eliminated. Some of these judgments were made during the Unification Wars, when the Emperor himself was available to assess each threat and prescribe its containment. Others were made over the subsequent millennia by Lockwardens who had to rely on their own knowledge and their own instincts without the benefit of the Emperor's personal guidance. And the categorization of the prisoners is itself a complex undertaking. Some are clearly entities, beings with consciousness and agency that can think and plan and act with deliberate intent. Others are artifacts, objects that possess dangerous properties but lack any form of sentient will. And then there are things that fall into neither category cleanly, hybrid creations that blur the line between creature and device, between weapon and wielder, as between the thing that threatens and the threat itself. The Shadowkeepers have developed elaborate taxonomies to classify these prisoners, systems of categorization that have been refined over 10,000 years of observation and study. But even the most sophisticated taxonomy struggles to account for things that were created by minds operating at levels of scientific understanding that the current Imperium cannot even approximate, let alone replicate. There is the entity known as the Slithering Dreamer, which escaped from its cell and was later tracked down and killed by the Shadowkeeper Jehal Feldorus Gao on a world called Tarnus IV. The fact that this creature was killed rather than recaptured suggests that not all escaped prisoners are meant to be returned alive. Some are simply too dangerous to transport, too unpredictable to contain a second time. And the Shadowkeepers are authorized to use lethal force when containment is no longer feasible. There is the Black Periapt, an artifact whose nature is not described in detail, but whose name, drawn from old Terran languages meaning a protective charm or amulet, suggests some connection to psychic or warp-based phenomena. There is the Vexen Cage, described as a psychic amplifier capable of subduing and mentally enslaving thousands of people simultaneously. Think about what that means in the context of the Imperium. A device that can take control of thousands of minds at once would be a weapon of almost unimaginable power in the hands of a sufficiently ruthless wielder. It could turn entire populations into puppet armies, neutralize planetary defenses without firing a shot, or create chaos on a scale that would make a demonic incursion look like a minor inconvenience. As the fact that the Emperor chose to lock this device away rather than use it or destroy it tells us something profound about his assessment of its danger. There are entries in the catalogue with names that suggest horrors of a more abstract and fundamental nature: the sorrow of Caracalla, the lament of unreason, the granter of all 6 wishes, the eater of gods, the serpent of ending, the unmaker of thrones, the last whispers of eternity. These names read like the chapter headings of a forbidden grimoire, each one hinting at a specific kind of cosmic danger that defies easy categorization. What is the Eater of Gods? What happens when the Unmaker of Thrones is unleashed? What are the last whispers of eternity, and why were they considered dangerous enough to imprison? The lore does not tell us, and perhaps that is for the best, because the answers to these questions might be more than any mortal mind could safely contain. The list also includes Subject 11, and a thing called It That Craves, and another called One of the Fell, and the Tri-Blight Amulet, and the Sevenfold Trimiasma, and the Chalice of Dark Alabaster, and Eight of the Skull, and the Soul Delver. Each name carries its own weight of implied horror, its own suggestion of a specific kind of danger, or malice, or cosmic wrongness that the Emperor decided humanity must be protected from. And then there is Cypher, the enigmatic space marine known as Cypher, the Lord of the Fallen, the most mysterious and most hunted figure associated with the Dark Angels chapter, was imprisoned in the Dark Cells after he and a small band of fallen angels helped the reborn Primarch Reboot Gilliman escape from captivity and return to Terra. Despite having saved the Primarch's life, the suspicions surrounding Cypher were too profound and too ancient to be dismissed, and he was locked away in the Dark Cells alongside the horrors of Old Night. But Cypher is not an ordinary prisoner, and the Dark Cells, for all their vaunted security, were not designed to contain a being of his particular talents. Cypher is not a horror of Old Night. He is not an artifact of forbidden technology or an entity born from the intersection of Dark Age science and warp energy. He is a space marine, albeit one of extraordinary capability and mysterious purpose. And the containment measures of the Dark Cells are calibrated for threats of a fundamentally different nature. The rune locks and psychic wards that can hold entities of cosmic power are less effective against a prisoner whose primary advantages are not supernatural in nature, but rather stem from an almost preternatural ability to predict events, manipulate circumstances, and exploit the smallest gaps in any security system. When the Great Rift opened and the resulting chaos disrupted the palace's defenses, Cypher seized his opportunity. The circumstances of his escape are described in the novel Cypher, Lord of the Fallen by John French, and they involve a complex series of seemingly coincidental events that, when examined in hindsight, form a pattern so intricate that it is impossible to determine whether Cypher orchestrated them or merely possessed the uncanny ability to foresee and exploit them. As a Dark Angels strike team had infiltrated the palace, intent on capturing Cypher themselves, and in the process, they inadvertently damaged key security systems along their route. The demonic incursion against the Lion's Gate further stretched the palace's defenders and diverted attention from the lower levels. And at just the right moment, when all of these factors aligned in a perfect storm of distraction and vulnerability, Cypher moved. Yet whether Cypher orchestrated these events or merely took advantage of them is a question that the narrative deliberately leaves unanswered, but the result was the same. Cypher and his fallen brothers broke free of the Dark Cells and made their way deeper into the palace complex, evading Custodian guards and Imperial assassins alike. As the fact that Cypher was able to escape from the Dark Cells at all is a remarkable testament to his abilities, and a sobering reminder of the limitations of even the most formidable containment measures. The Dark Cells were designed to hold entities that could reshape reality with a thought or dissolve matter with a touch. The fact that a single Space Marine, however exceptional, yet was able to slip through their defenses during a moment of crisis speaks to the vulnerability that the Great Rift exposed in the Shadowkeeper's carefully maintained prison. Cypher's escape, combined with the disappearance of the other entities and artifacts from the suddenly empty cells, represented the most catastrophic security breach in the Dark Cells' 10,000-year history. It was a failure that struck at the very heart of the Shadowkeeper's identity and purpose, a failure that called into question the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire existence was built. The cells were supposed to be inviolable, the prisoners were supposed to be contained forever. And now, in the space of a single terrible moment, both of those certainties had been shattered. The psychological impact of this failure on the Shadowkeepers themselves is not directly addressed in the lore, but it is not difficult to imagine. But these are warriors who have dedicated their entire existence to a single purpose, who have sacrificed everything: comfort, companionship, glory, recognition, for the sake of keeping the galaxy safe from the horrors beneath the palace. To discover that their prison has been breached, that their prisoners have escaped, that their comrades have been killed, that their 10,000-year vigil has been broken, this must have been a blow of almost existential proportions. And yet the Shadowkeepers did not crumble. They did not despair. They adapted, as Custodians always do, and they set about the grim work of recapturing what had been lost. The Shadowkeepers Unleashed, Missions in the Era, Indomitus. The opening of the Great Rift did more than just release prisoners from the dark cells. It fundamentally transformed the Shadowkeepers from a static defensive force into an active, galaxy-spanning hunter-killer formation. For the first time in their history, the black-armored warriors of the dark cells were a common sight on battlefields across the Imperium, appearing without warning or explanation, conducting operations that no other Imperial force was allowed to question, and departing as silently as they had arrived. The lore gives us several specific examples of Shadowkeeper operations in the era Indomitus that help illustrate the scope and nature of their new mission. One of the most intriguing of these is a mission designated Into Shadow, in which a small, fast-moving force of Custodians was dispatched upon the direct orders of Captain General Trajan Valoris to the ruined remains of Cadia. The details of this mission were suppressed even among the Custodians' own comrades, but the force was accompanied by warriors drawn from the ranks of the Shadowkeepers. Cadia, of course, was the fortress world that had served as the Imperium's primary bulwark against the forces of chaos for millennia before it was destroyed during Abaddon, the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade. The planet's destruction was one of the catalysts for the formation of the Great Rift, and the ruins of Cadia, drifting in the void at the very edge of the Eye of Terror, are among the most dangerous and most mysterious locations in the entire galaxy. What the Shadowkeepers were looking for on Cadia, the lore does not tell us. But the fact that Trajan Valoris himself ordered the mission, and that Shadowkeepers were specifically included in the force, tells us that whatever they were seeking was directly related to the dark cells and the horrors of Old Night. It is possible that one of the escaped prisoners had been tracked to the Cadian ruins. It is possible that the destruction of Cadia had exposed some artifact or entity that had been buried on the planet for millennia, us predating even the founding of the fortress world itself. Whatever the case, it was important enough to warrant the deployment of Shadowkeepers to one of the most dangerous locations in the galaxy, and important enough to be kept secret from virtually everyone who was not directly involved. Perhaps even more remarkable than the Cadian mission was an event that occurred at the beginning of the Indomitus Crusade, Ed Gilliman's desperate and determined campaign to drive back the forces of chaos and stabilize the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift. During this period, the Shadowkeepers did something that was utterly unprecedented in their entire history. They opened one of the dark cells and gave its contents to the Imperial Fist's Space Marine chapter. The Imperial Fist's massive mobile fortress, the Phalanx, one of the most powerful warships in the entire Imperium, had been severely damaged during the recent conflicts, and the chapter was in desperate need of the technology required to repair it. The Shadowkeepers, in what the lore describes as an uncharacteristic act of assistance, opened a specific cell and provided the Imperial Fists with the technology they needed to restore the Phalanx to full operational status. This event raises more questions than it answers. What kind of technology was stored in the dark cells that was capable of repairing one of the most advanced warships in the Imperium? How did the Shadowkeepers know that this technology existed and could be used for this purpose? And most importantly, who authorized the opening of a dark cell? The Lock Warden does not make such decisions lightly, and the idea of voluntarily opening one of the sealed cells, as releasing even a relatively benign piece of technology from the prison that has held it for millennia, goes against every principle that the Shadow Keepers have upheld since their founding. The most likely explanation is that this decision was made at the highest possible level, probably with the involvement of Captain General Valoris and potentially with the tacit approval of Guilliman himself. While the Indomitus Crusade represented the Imperium's best and possibly only chance to recover from the catastrophe of the Great Rift, and the Phalanx was a critical asset in that effort. If the choice was between keeping a single cell sealed and ensuring the success of a crusade that might determine the fate of humanity, the calculus, however agonizing, would have been clear. But the fact that the technology was there in the first place, locked away in the dark cells alongside the horrors of old night, tells us something important about the nature of the Shadow Keeper's collection. Not everything in the dark cells is inherently evil or malicious. Some of the things imprisoned beneath the palace are simply too powerful or too dangerous to be allowed to exist freely, regardless of their moral character. The technology that repaired the Phalanx might have been perfectly benign in isolation, but in the wrong hands, on or deployed at the wrong moment, or combined with the wrong complementary systems, it could have been catastrophically dangerous. The Emperor's decision to lock it away was not a judgment on the technology itself, but a judgment on humanity's readiness to use it responsibly. This nuance is important because it adds a layer of moral complexity to the Shadow Keeper's mission that is easy to overlook. They are not simply guarding monsters in a dungeon. They are curating a collection of the most dangerous knowledge and power in the galaxy, making decisions about what humanity is ready to know and what must remain hidden, at least for now. It is a responsibility that requires not just courage and vigilance, but also wisdom, a quality that is sometimes in short supply, even among the Emperor's golden warriors. The Shadow Keeper's operations in the era Indomitus also brought them into contact, and sometimes into conflict, with other Imperial forces who did not understand or appreciate their mission. The Shadow Keepers do not explain themselves. They arrive, they conduct their operations, they depart, and anyone who gets in their way is dealt with, firmly and permanently. This approach, while effective, has occasionally created friction with other branches of the Imperial military, particularly the Inquisition, which tends to view any organization that refuses to share its secrets as inherently suspicious. But the Shadow Keepers are above the Inquisition. They are above the High Lords of Terror. They are above every authority in the Imperium, save the Emperor himself, and the Emperor is in no position to countermand their decisions. The Shadow Keepers operate with a degree of autonomy that no other Imperial organization enjoys, and they use that autonomy to do whatever they deem necessary to protect humanity from the horrors of old night, yet without regard for the political consequences or the bruised egos that their actions might leave in their wake. A brotherhood apart. The character and culture of the Shadow Keepers. To truly understand the Shadow Keepers, we must look beyond their military function and their operational history and examine what they are as a culture, as a community of warriors, bound together by a shared burden that no one else in the galaxy could possibly comprehend. Because the Shadow Keepers are not merely soldiers performing a duty, they are something closer to monks, devotees of a faith that has no scripture and no rituals save the endless, repetitive act of vigilance itself. Consider the psychological toll of their existence. A Shadow Keeper's life is defined by the constant presence of terror, not the sharp, adrenaline-fueled terror of battle, which is brief and bracing, and can even be exhilarating for a warrior of sufficient skill and courage. And this is a slow, grinding, ambient terror that never stops, that seeps into the bones and settles in the marrow. A terror generated by the awareness that the things you are guarding could end civilization itself if they ever broke free. It is a terror that has no outlet and no relief, because the source of that terror never goes away. It is always there, pressing against the locked doors and the warded walls, whispering in frequencies that only a Custodian's enhanced senses can detect, been promising horrors that only a Custodian's enhanced intellect can fully comprehend. This is the environment in which the Shadow Keepers live and work, decade after decade, century after century. And it shapes them in ways that are visible even to their golden brothers. The Shadow Keepers are harder than other Custodians, more rigid, more intense, less inclined to the philosophical discourse and artistic appreciation that characterize the broader Custodian culture. Where other Custodians might spend their rare moments of leisure studying the works of ancient Terran poets or debating the finer points of combat theory, the Shadow Keepers spend their downtime reviewing containment protocols, inspecting warding sigils, and running mental simulations of worst-case scenario breakout events. They are, in a sense, the most purely functional members of the Adeptus Custodes. Everything about them is optimized for their specific task. While their armor is dark because it helps them move unseen in the lightless corridors. Their weapons are specialized because the things they might need to fight are unlike anything that other Custodians encounter. Their social interactions are minimal because the less energy they spend on communication, the more they can devote to vigilance. They are machines of awareness, engines of watchfulness, and they have sacrificed every other aspect of their existence on the altar of that singular purpose. But they are not machines. That is the crucial point, the one that elevates the Shadow Keepers from mere interesting background detail to genuinely compelling characters within the broader narrative of Warhammer 40,000. They are living, thinking, feeling beings who have chosen, or been chosen for, a duty that strips away almost everything that makes existence bearable and replaces it with an endless, grinding, silent vigil over the worst things that the galaxy has ever produced. And they know what they are giving up. They understand the sacrifice they are making, and they make it anyway, because they understand something that most other beings in the Imperium do not, that the alternative is unthinkable. There is a peculiar form of nobility in the Shadow Keeper's sacrifice, a quiet heroism that goes unrecognized and unrewarded. No one writes songs about the warriors who stand watch over locked doors. No one raises monuments to the men and women who spend their lives in darkness, keeping the nightmares at bay. The Shadow Keepers will never be celebrated, never be honored, never be remembered by the masses of humanity whose lives depend on their vigilance. And they accept this anonymity, not with bitterness or resentment, but with the same grim determination that characterizes everything else about them. They do not need recognition. They do not seek glory. Yet they need only the knowledge that the cells are secure, the wards are intact, and the horrors of old night remain where they belong. The relationship between the Shadow Keepers and other shield hosts within the Adeptus Custodes is complex and not always comfortable. Other Custodians respect the Shadow Keepers, certainly, perhaps more than they respect any other shield host, because every Custodian understands, at least in the abstract, the magnitude of the burden that the Shadow Keepers bear. But there is also a certain wariness in their interactions, a recognition that the Shadow Keepers know things that other Custodians do not, secrets that even the Captain General may not be fully privy to, truths about the foundations of the Imperium that could shake the faith of even the most dedicated servant of the Emperor. The Lock Warden, in particular, occupies a unique position within the Custodian hierarchy. His rank is technically equivalent to that of any other shield captain, but his actual authority and influence extend far beyond what his formal position would suggest. The Lock Warden has the right, and indeed the duty, to override any other Custodian's commands if the security of the dark cells is at stake. He can requisition resources, commandeer ships, and deploy warriors from other shield hosts if he deems it necessary, and no one short of the Captain General himself can gainsay him. This extraordinary authority reflects the extraordinary importance of the Lock Warden's mission, and it serves as a constant reminder to the rest of the 10,000 that, for all their many and varied duties, the defense of the Dark Cells is, and always will be, the most critical function that the Adeptus Custodes performs. The recruitment and induction of new Shadow Keepers is itself a process shrouded in mystery. We know that Custodians are not born into any particular shield host. They are assigned, based on their aptitudes and their temperament, to the host that best suits their particular strengths. For the Shadow Keepers, this means selecting Custodians who possess an exceptional tolerance for psychological stress, an unusual degree of mental discipline even by Custodian standards, and a capacity for sustained vigilance that borders on the superhuman. Whilst these qualities are tested through a series of trials, whose specific nature is not described in the lore, but which presumably involve extended periods of exposure to the psychic environment of the dark cells, allowing the veteran Shadowkeepers to observe how the candidate responds to the unique pressures of the subterranean fortress. Those who pass these trials are inducted into the Shield Host with a ceremony that is as spare and as utilitarian as everything else about the Shadowkeepers. Oh, the darkness does not wait for ceremony. The darkness does not wait for ceremony, and neither do the Shadowkeepers. The weight of knowing, secrets, silence, and the price of guardianship. What does it cost to know what the Shadowkeepers know? To carry in your mind the names and natures of things that could unmake the Imperium. To understand, as with a clarity that most beings could never endure, just how fragile the barrier between civilization and annihilation truly is. This question lies at the philosophical heart of the Shadowkeepers' story, and it connects them to one of the deepest and most enduring themes in the broader Warhammer 40,000 narrative: the tension between knowledge and safety, between the desire to understand the universe and the recognition that some truths are simply too dangerous to be widely known. The Imperium of man is, in many ways, founded on ignorance. The vast majority of the Imperium's trillions of citizens have no idea what the warp truly is, how the Golden Throne functions, what the Space Marines actually are, or how the Imperium's faster-than-light travel works. They certainly have no idea that beneath the Imperial Palace, beneath the very seat of the Emperor's power, there are things imprisoned that could destroy everything they know and love in a heartbeat. This ignorance is not accidental. It is a deliberate policy, enforced at every level of Imperial society, from the planetary governor who burns books that mention the age of strife to the Inquisitor who executes anyone who asks too many questions about the nature of chaos. The Shadowkeepers are the ultimate expression of this policy. They are the keepers of the most dangerous knowledge in the Imperium, and they bear that knowledge in absolute silence, sharing it with no one outside their ranks. The weight of this burden is difficult to overstate. Every Shadowkeeper walks through the corridors of the dark cells, knowing, with perfect, agonizing clarity, exactly what is behind each locked door. They know what each prisoner wants, what it is capable of, what it would do if it were freed. They know the specific mechanisms by which each entity could bring about the destruction of the Imperium, and they carry this knowledge every moment of every day, sleeping and waking, for as long as they serve. This knowledge isolates them from their brothers in ways that go beyond mere physical separation. When a Shadowkeeper interacts with a Custodian from another Shield host, there is always a gap between them, a space that cannot be bridged because the Shadowkeeper possesses information that the other Custodian does not and cannot be given. The Golden Warrior might talk about the latest threat to the Sol system or the progress of the Indomitus Crusade, while the Shadowkeeper nods and responds appropriately, all the while carrying in his mind the awareness that the things he guards are more dangerous than any army, any crusade, any military threat that the galaxy has ever produced. The question of whether this level of secrecy is justified is one that the law does not answer definitively, and it is probably impossible to answer in any case. On one hand, the argument for secrecy is compelling, as the things in the dark cells are dangerous precisely because knowledge of them could be exploited by those who would misuse it. If the forces of chaos learned what was imprisoned beneath the palace, they would stop at nothing to break those prisoners free. If ambitious or desperate Imperial commanders learned of the technologies locked away in the cells, they might try to access them for their own purposes with potentially catastrophic results. Even the knowledge that the dark cells exist at all could be destabilizing, undermining confidence in the Imperium's security and creating panic among a population that is already stretched to the breaking point by the demands of an endless war. On the other hand, the argument against secrecy is equally compelling. Knowledge that is hoarded rather than shared cannot be studied, cannot be analyzed, cannot be used to develop countermeasures or defenses. The Shadowkeeper's monopoly on information about the Dark Cells means that if the Shadowkeepers themselves are ever compromised or destroyed, all of that knowledge will be lost, leaving the Imperium defenseless against threats that it does not even know exist. Furthermore, the concentration of so much dangerous knowledge in such a small group of individuals creates a single point of failure, a vulnerability that any sufficiently clever enemy could exploit. This tension between secrecy and security is not unique to the Shadowkeepers. It is a recurring theme throughout the Warhammer 40,000 universe, from the Inquisition's endless debates about the proper handling of forbidden knowledge to the Space Marine chapter's carefully maintained secrecy about their own genetic heritage. But in the Shadowkeepers, this tension is expressed in its purest and most concentrated form. Because the things they are keeping secret are not mere military intelligence or political scandal. They are existential threats to the survival of the human species, and the decision to keep them hidden is a decision that affects every living being in the galaxy, whether they know it or not. The Shadowkeepers themselves do not appear to struggle with this ethical dimension of their duty. They accept the necessity of secrecy as they accept every other aspect of their mission, completely, absolutely, and without reservation. For them, the question is not whether the secrets should be kept, but whether the secrets can be kept. And to that question, they have only one answer: they must be. Because the alternative is a darkness that makes the grim darkness of the far future look like a sunny afternoon. This absolutism is both the Shadowkeepers' greatest strength and their most defining characteristic. They do not compromise. They do not negotiate. They do not bend. They stand in the darkness and they hold the line, and they will continue to hold it until the last Shadowkeeper falls and the last cell stands empty, or until the Emperor himself rises from his throne and tells them that their vigil is ended. Neither outcome seems particularly likely in the foreseeable future, which means that the Shadowkeepers will continue to do what they have always done: stand watch over the nightmares of an age that the galaxy has tried very hard to forget, and ensure that those nightmares never wake again. There is something deeply compelling about the Shadowkeepers as a concept, something that resonates beyond the specific details of their lore and touches on universal themes of duty, sacrifice, and the price of knowledge. In a setting defined by grand battles and cosmic threats and the clash of titanic forces across 1,000,000 worlds, the Shadowkeepers remind us that some of the most important battles are fought in silence, in the dark, and by warriors who will never be thanked for their service. They are the antidote to the glamour of war, the quiet correction to the idea that heroism is always dramatic and visible and celebrated by grateful crowds. The Shadowkeepers also raise profound questions about the nature of the Imperium itself. What does it say about a civilization that it must lock away portions of its own history in order to survive? What does it say about humanity that the achievements of its golden age are now counted among its greatest threats? The Dark Cells are, in a very real sense, a monument to human hubris, a reminder that the same genius that built the Men of Iron and the standard template construct systems and the warp drives that carried humanity to the stars also produced horrors that could snuff out the species like a candle flame in a hurricane. The Emperor understood this. He understood that human genius, unchecked by wisdom and unconstrained by moral awareness, was capable of producing things that would make the gods themselves shudder. And so, he built the Dark Cells, not as a punishment for humanity's past mistakes, but as a safeguard against its future ones. The technology and the entities imprisoned beneath the palace are not evil in the way that chaos is evil, not inherently malicious in the way that a demon is malicious. They are simply too powerful for a species that has not yet learned to wield such power responsibly. Someday, perhaps, humanity will be ready. Someday, the cells might be opened and their contents used for the betterment of all. But that day has not come, and until it does, the Shadowkeepers will stand their vigil. In the context of the current narrative of Warhammer 40,000, the Shadowkeepers occupy a fascinating position, where the Indomitus Crusade is the largest military operation since the Great Crusade itself, a desperate effort to push back the forces of chaos and stabilize the Imperium in the wake of the Great Rift. Guilliman, the Primarch returned, is reshaping the Imperium according to his own vision, creating new institutions and reforming old ones. The Custodians themselves have been unleashed upon the galaxy in a way that has not been seen since the days of the Emperor's own command. And through it all, yet the Shadowkeepers continue their ancient work, adapting to the new reality while remaining true to the fundamental principles that have guided them for 10 millennia. The decision to open a dark cell and provide the Imperial Fists with the technology needed to restore the Phalanx is perhaps the most symbolically significant event in the Shadowkeepers' recent history. It represents a departure from their traditional absolutism and a willingness to engage with the wider Imperium in ways that they have historically avoided. It suggests that even the most rigid and unyielding institutions can adapt when the circumstances demand it, and it raises the tantalizing possibility that the dark cells might serve as more than just a prison in the future. Could there be other technologies, other artifacts, locked away beneath the palace that could help the Imperium survive the current crisis? And if so, how would the Shadowkeepers be willing to release them? These are questions that the lore has not yet answered, and they represent some of the most intriguing narrative possibilities in the entire Warhammer 40,000 setting. The Dark Cells are a treasure trove of potential story hooks, each sealed door representing a mystery that could spawn entire novels or campaigns or codex supplements. What is the Eater of Gods, and what would happen if it were released during a Tyrannid invasion? What is the Unmaker of Thrones, and could it be used against the forces of chaos? What are the last whispers of eternity, and do they hold the key to humanity's salvation or its final damnation? The beauty of the Shadowkeepers' lore is that it leaves these questions unanswered, allowing the imagination to fill in the blanks with possibilities that are more terrifying and more tantalizing than any explicit answer could be. The Dark Cells are a narrative black hole, a point of infinite density from which stories and speculation radiate outward in all directions, drawing in the curiosity of fans and lore enthusiasts like moths to a flame that burns with the cold, dark light of old night. And at the center of that black hole, standing in the deepest darkness with their weapons ready and their minds clear, are the Shadowkeepers, the silent sentinels, the forgotten guardians, the warriors who keep the nightmares at bay so that the rest of the galaxy can go on fighting its wars and building its cathedrals and telling its stories without ever knowing just how close the abyss really is. Echoes of Eternity, what the Shadowkeepers mean for the future of the Imperium. As we bring our journey to a close and begin the long climb back up from the depths of the Dark Cells toward the light of the surface, it is worth pausing to consider what the Shadowkeepers represent within the broader context of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and what their story might mean for the future of the Imperium. The Shadowkeepers exist at the intersection of several of the setting's most fundamental themes. They embody the Imperium's relationship with its own past, particularly the terrible legacy of the Age of Strife and the Dark Age of technology that preceded it. Yes, they represent the moral and philosophical costs of the Imperium's approach to knowledge and power, the trade-offs that must be made when survival is the highest priority and every other consideration is secondary. And they serve as a reminder that the greatest threats to humanity's existence may not be the ones that announce themselves with armies and war fleets and declarations of war, but the quiet ones, the hidden ones, but the ones that wait in the darkness with infinite patience for the moment when the guards grow tired and the walls grow thin. In the era of the Indomitus Crusade, with the Great Rift splitting the galaxy and chaos ascendant on 100,000 fronts, the Shadowkeepers are more important than they have ever been. The escaped prisoners of the Dark Cells represent a threat that is qualitatively different from anything else the Imperium faces. What would seem like godhood to the benighted would seem like godhood to the benighted masses of the 41st millennium, and their capabilities may exceed anything that the current Imperium can match. The fact that the Shadowkeepers have been deployed to the ruins of Cadia on the direct orders of Captain General Valoris Eames suggests that at least some of the escaped prisoners are connected to the events of the Great Rift itself. If those entities are able to interact with or exacerbate the effects of the rift, the consequences could be catastrophic on a scale that dwarfs even the current crisis. The Imperium is already fighting for its survival. If the horrors of Old Night are added to the equation, the already dire strategic situation could become truly hopeless. And yet there is also a strange kind of hope in the Shadowkeeper's story. Not the bright, optimistic hope of a dawn breaking after a long night, but a harder, grimmer kind of hope. The hope that comes from knowing that there are still warriors willing to stand against the darkness, even when the darkness seems overwhelming. The Shadowkeepers have endured for 10,000 years. They have withstood the psychic pressure of the dark cells, the loneliness of their vigil, the crushing weight of their knowledge, and now the shock of their greatest failure. And they are still standing, still watching, still guarding, still holding the line. That resilience, that unbreakable commitment to duty in the face of impossible odds, is the heart of what the Shadowkeepers represent. They are a reminder that in the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and suffering and the slow decay of everything that humanity once aspired to be, and there are still those who refuse to surrender. Those who will stand in the deepest dark and hold their ground, not because they believe they can win, but because the act of standing is itself the victory. The sable-armored warriors of the Shadowkeepers will never be celebrated in the way that other Imperial heroes are celebrated. Their names will never be chanted by adoring crowds or inscribed on monuments visible to the general public. They will live and die in the shadows, in doing work that the galaxy will never know about and never appreciate. And that is exactly as it should be, because the best measure of the Shadowkeeper's success is the simple, profound fact that the galaxy continues to exist at all. As long as the Shadowkeepers stand their vigil, as long as the Lock Warden holds his keys, as long as the rune locks hold, and the wards endure, and the sanctic circles remain unbroken, the horrors of Old Night will stay where they belong, are locked away in the deepest darkness beneath the Emperor's throne, forgotten by a galaxy that does not even know to be grateful. And on that note, we surface. We climb up out of the abyss, leaving behind the cold and the silence and the pressing weight of ancient dread, and we return to the light of the galaxy above. The dark cells remain below us, as they have for 10,000 years, and within them, the Shadowkeepers continue their eternal patrol, their black armor one with the gloom, their weapons ready, their minds clear, their vigil unbroken. Thank you all so much for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most fascinating and underappreciated corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore. The Shadowkeepers are one of those factions that reward deeper exploration, and I hope this video has given you a new appreciation for the warriors who guard the darkest secrets of the Imperium. If you enjoyed this journey into the depths of the Imperial Palace, please hit that like button and subscribe to Q on 40,000 so you do not miss any future deep dives into the grim darkness of the far future. Drop a comment below and let me know which shield host of the Adeptus Custodes you find most interesting, or if there is another topic you would like me to explore in a future video. Until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, in the depths below the throne, someone is always watching, and because of them, you can sleep a little easier tonight.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.